Welcome to our next webinar on mental health and performing artists. I'm Dr. Nancy Kadel, and I'm your host today. Today we will explore loss and grief. We do have four special guests you likely know well by now, Doctors Lynda Mainwaring, Paula Thompson, and Bonnie Robson, and Mr. Peter Lewton-Brain, the current president of IADAMS. These webinar recordings have been developed through a mental health working group arising from the International Association for Dance, Medicine, and Science. Our objectives for today's webinar are to, 1, describe the different types of loss and normal human responses to this. 2, we hope to offer some concrete strategies that may help those suffering a loss. We are aware that today's topic is complex and highly individual. The ideas shared in this webinar may not serve the needs or the concerns of all of our listeners. We do invite you to reach out to us with questions or to contact local grief support groups or crisis hotlines if you have any specific concerns. You may find links to all of our recordings on the IADAMS smartphone app, the YouTube channel, Facebook page, and our Instagram. A dancer asks us this question: is it normal for me to be grieving the loss of my current career as a dancer? I'm also aware that some of my friends have lost a family member. What should I do to help my friends while I am also feeling this painful loss of my performance season this year? I feel guilty and confused. Lynda, in answering this dancer's questions, can you introduce us to the topics of grief and loss and give us a framework to help us better understand about the normal grieving process?
This topic is complex, as that dancer has identified. Let me begin with a poem by Grace Noel Crowell. I think it helps us understand the process of grief. To one in sorrow. Let me come in where you are weeping, friend, and let me take your hand. I, who have known a sorrow such as yours, can understand. Let me come in. I would be very still, beside you in your grief. I would not bid you cease your weeping, friend. Tears can bring relief. Let me come in. I would only breathe a prayer and hold your hand, for I have known a sorrow such as yours, and understand. This poem helps us understand and recognize what grieving is all about and how very difficult and painful grief can be. It can be quite overwhelming. The poem suggests that connections to feelings through quiet contemplation or traditional ways, perhaps through prayer, can be very helpful, and connecting with others is quite important. The poem doesn't identify any specific type of loss, but there are many types of loss, and let me name a few. There is, of course, loss of a loved one through death, loss of health, loss of functioning through illness, loss of relationships, loss of work or income, loss of identity, loss of status, loss of an audience, and loss of your own sense of well-being in some cases, and loss of freedom to move. Those are just a few examples. Now, normal grieving is a process that may involve intense sadness and a palpable sense of something's missing, it's not there. And depending on the kind of loss and attachment one has had with the lost person or the object of loss, you can have different reactions. With the loss of a loved one can feel enormous grief and somatic and emotional pain that zaps the energy right out of you. Normal grief can be debilitating and disorienting, and it can be accompanied by various emotions. Each of us experiences grief in our own particular way, and one may have low mood, feelings of anger, sorrow, shock, denial, where you just cannot or do not want to accept that something has happened. You can feel guilty, frustrated, worried, and concerned, and you can have this overwhelming sadness. Ultimately, in the case of death of a loved one may learn to live with the emptiness and accept that the person is no longer physically present. In good relationships, we hold memories very dear, and we have strong representations in our mind of our loved ones, and those can sustain us as we learn to live without them. In complicated or difficult grief that Paula is going to talk about, the reaction to loss can be quite debilitating to the point of not being able to carry on or an inability to function in our typical activities of daily living. And individuals who experience trauma in childhood or did not have the opportunity to develop secure relationships or attachments through the developmental years may have great difficulty with loss, and grief becomes prolonged, in some cases complex and quite unresolved. And in such cases, professional help is necessary. Of course, there are times when being alone and crying endlessly is all we can manage. And that's okay. And as the poem suggests, tears can bring relief. Many of us find ourselves with different experiences of loss. The most devastating, of course, the loss of a loved one. In some cases, we've been deprived of precious, precious time before and during the loved one's passing, a time of reflection, quiet contemplation, and of communication with that loved one, of deep, deep feelings. And in some cases, we may have unresolved conflicts or difficulties that we haven't had the opportunity to discuss with our loved one. What can we do to help ourselves and help others as well? Number one, there are 6 that I'd like to offer. The first with connect with your feelings, embrace your feelings, recognize that these feelings are part of the human condition and part of your experience with loss and grief. 2, find ways to manage and regulate your feelings. Find things that you might be able to do to honor the grief and the object of grief. 3, connect with compassionate others. That social support is important. And 4, be compassionate with yourself and give yourself time to grieve. You may need weeks, months, and even years. Grief is something that lasts a long time. It's not just over very quickly. And number 5, connect with your inner resources, that inner resilience we all have, or connect with your personal or cultural rituals or your faith. And lastly, find small moments of joy, laughter, and memories. And importantly, find hope inside yourself and elsewhere.
Thank you, Lynda, for giving us some really clear strategies to help us navigate our grief in these times. Paula, Lynda has suggested that sometimes people have greater difficulty grieving. Can you tell us more about this painful possibility?
There is the possibility that you may have prolonged grief. And in 2022, the International Classification for Disease created by the World Health Organization is going to include this diagnosis of prolonged grief. Now, grieving process takes a long time. So it's not really about duration, it's about intensity. And many people, the grieving process becomes so intense that it becomes debilitating. So it might mimic depression or other kinds of disorders, but it's directly related to the loss. So it's the intensity of these feelings. And some of the markers that you may be struggling with prolonged grief is that your ability to function is pretty much non-existent. You're not able to do any of the daily activities. You feel like your entire life is empty, and that's a very powerful word, and that you're flat. For many, they feel that their self died when that other person died, that they don't really exist anymore. And consequently, social withdrawal is so pronounced that you can't really even be with others anymore. So that feeling of lack of trust and feeling like grief has gripped you completely, you're fully embraced by grief and nothing else, pervades your daily life. For some, they will then try to manage this by avoiding any memory of that person that they may have lost. Whereas for others, they can't stop focusing on it. Everything they speak about, everything they do is in relationship to that person that they have lost. Unfortunately, pretty much all the time, there's feelings of guilt and self-blame. The recrimination is persistent, that you caused the death, that you didn't do enough to stop the death. You didn't soothe them enough. You weren't there to show them how much you loved them. Those thoughts just fill the day. And what is really frightening about prolonged grief is that in your dream life, you start to feel that that deceased person is beckoning you to the other world. And that raises the suicidal risk very, very high. Now, why might someone have prolonged grief, the grieving process intensifying to this degree? Oftentimes, it can occur with the loss of a child. That pain is unbelievable. Or that somebody has been murdered. There's a sudden violent death. They were killed in a car accident. You didn't get to say goodbye. You had a fight with them in the morning. Those things can just torture someone. As Lynda mentioned, unresolved trauma from childhood may make that relationship with the person who's deceased even more complex. Systemic racism can also make that unresolved loss even more powerful. And we can see that with generational transmission of loss and grief that is handed down, that makes it very difficult to manage. So if you are feeling like you have some of these markers that grief is getting too intense, then you do need to seek professional help. It's not that you're depressed, it's that this grieving process is becoming impossible. And as Nietzsche said, one of the things that will get us through this life is figuring out the why that we are living. And when we have a why, we can manage all the hows to do this living thing. And when we look at great art, we can see that many of these artists have found a why. They found it through the expression of art. And it doesn't take much to look across the genres of music, theater, dance, and see iconic pieces that are really depicting prolonged grief, the intensity of that grief. So as artists, we have that opportunity to transfer this prolonged grief, the intensity of that loss, into an art form, which will give us the why. But it is a very serious problem, and you never know when it's going to be visited on you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Paula, for helping us to better understand the whole grieving process and how it can be very difficult and prolonged for some people. You had mentioned that in times of grief and loss, people can have their emotions fluctuate widely, from sorrow to joy, times of high energy to very low energy, and this can leave people feeling disorganized and disoriented. Peter, I was wondering if you could speak to us from your experience as a professional dancer on how roles that you have danced have been helpful to you personally in dealing with grief and loss.
Yes, I found that sometimes, for many times, the first experience with grief for dancers is actually a role you have to dance. And for example, Albrecht, who has to deal with this terrible grief and this notion of responsibility of someone's death. And this is, for the first time, many of us will have to really reflect upon what that means and how we deal with it and where we go from that. And of course, in the ballet, he has to, dance until he dies. And sometimes in the moment when he has to be dancing, he's having to do a entrecise with batterie, which is rather a happy step. So there's this terrible conflict of dancing happy step in a tragic moment. And can reflect us, we have to keep a smile on our face when we're going through grief and loss. We have to pretend to be happy. And these are part of this terrible wrenching which we go through. And then, of course, what saves him is the love of Giselle and his love for her. So love is a way through and why we're dancing, this love of dance. And of course, later on in life, we will all go through grief, and will have these experiences. But it's a major part of the art form of dealing with grief. It's in many, many theaters and theater pieces and ballets and operas, this notion of dealing with grief. So I encourage you all to dig deep down in yourselves and find your resourcefulness in these moments.
Oh, thank you, Peter. That was really beautiful. It is interesting to think that as young adults, many dancers are dancing roles in all different genres of dance that may have something to do with grief and loss. It is comforting to know that you've had practice working through grief and loss in a performance, and that you may be able to draw on those experiences to help you deal with grief and loss in your own life. Bonnie, as a retired psychiatrist, can you give us any guidance for dancers that may be suffering from grief and loss now?
Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to try. We now know that grieving takes time. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself that time. We've all told you that now. I should like to speak first, though, to dancers who've had a loss related to their career. Examples of losses we've heard: disappointing casting, cancellation of a gala, retirement performance, and loss of contract and position. With this loss goes the social connection, and that's what's so important, the loss of support of fellow dancers working on the same project. I would expect that professional dancers who have studied in residential programs would be familiar with the loss of classmates and best friends each year. Some students are not invited back, and some choose to leave. A similar experience occurs with apprentices in a company and everyone when you leave on a short-term contract. The relationship with other dancers can be intense, and it's so important, and to lose it, sometimes dancers report it feels as if the dancer's part of a family, but often this closeness is so short-lived. It can help if you react to the loss with an activity, such as going online and making a video, something that the dancer can remember. A remembrance such as this is a token more lasting than flowers and one night's applause. If you are leaving, even though you may be angry, do try to say goodbye to everyone. Your kindness to them may be more important than you think. Make sure you get all the special information and their social connections, and do periodically contact them. Again, it's a kindness. It's okay to be angry, even expected to be angry. When angry, I like to use I statements. I am so angry. I am even angrier that I can't do anything about it. I have to be careful not to blame anyone for these feelings, and especially not to write anything on email when I'm angry that I might later regret. However, I may express my anger on paper, as if I were sending a letter, and I write it down and then tear it up and destroy it. And I can write another one later if I want. We must now think about strategies to help with loss through the death of a loved one, or don't forget your pets. Sharing mourning with family and friends has been the traditional time-honored process. It's not at all unusual for one who is grieving to have a strong sense of the presence of the lost person. Sometimes a person will search for the deceased consciously and unconsciously for a long time. As the weeks go by, one feels the despair more intensely, and the permanence of the loss is acknowledged. Here's where mindfulness practice can be very useful in helping you to accept your thoughts just as they are, without any judgment. Memories of the deceased, as Lynda said, are treasures. These memories can be recalled sometimes by looking at photos and recalling the events that go with them. It can be comforting to share these memories with someone. Another way of putting this is to list all the things of that lost person that you're grateful for, and some of the fun times you had. But as Paula said, there can also be the negative memories. How are you going to deal with those? You may have unresolved issues with the lost person. I find that writing down what I would say if I had an opportunity to do so, and then actually saying it out loud as if they could hear me. I imagine how they would respond, and then I explain my feelings. For example, why didn't you come to my birthday and my recitals? I was hurt. I thought you didn't care. I know you said you had to work. I was little. It was so important to me. Now, a therapist might need to help you resolve some of those feelings, and I want you to think about that, because this is, and remember the prolonged grief items that Paula gave you. Dancing makes people feel better. Dance for your loss. Allow yourself to enjoy the dance. I have noted many teachers are dedicating their classes to a lost or living but distant relative. You might dance in the fresh air, mindful of your dance surface, of course. When available, obtain massage and physiotherapy if you can. Other self-care practices include, of course, the healthy diet, exercise, and regular and sufficient sleep that we've mentioned. Personal soothing times, such as listening to your favorite music or having candles, might be helpful. When do you need to call a grief hotline or go to a walk-in clinic or emergency? As Dr. Thompson explained, some individuals will experience a more prolonged and more intense grief response. Dancers don't like to make mistakes. They like to perform well. So it's distressing to you to not know how to behave. Talking and venting your frustration, as I'm doing now, can be very helpful. Professional dancers live in a code of silence. They do not usually share their difficulties. If you're depressed and thinking morbid and suicidal thoughts, or having strong impulses to join the lost person, you need to get help, as Paula told us. Suicidal thoughts are always serious. This is where you want to see a physician or a mental health clinic. They will be able to offer you an individual program just for you. If you have a friend in trouble, get help. Call a helpline. No one should take on the responsibility of keeping their friend's distress a secret. I should like to add to what Paula has said about resilience. Dancers need to use their strength to mourn, to grieve, to cry, and to share. And they need to accept the support of friends and family and health services to accomplish this.
Bonnie, thank you so much for all the tools you shared with us for helping ourselves to deal with grief and loss. And thank you for so eloquently reminding dancers to draw upon their own strength, but also to accept support from family, from friends, and from professionals. I would like to thank all of our amazing experts today for their contributions. And again, to remind you, please seek out professional help if you're suffering. Please join us for our next webinar, which will be titled Depression, Dark Night of the Soul. Thank you.